Okay, so welcome everybody to our feedback in coaching session, feedback ethics. And I'm Angela Hill, and I'm a professional coach and supervisor with the OCM group, and also a volunteer with the MCC Global Centre for Excellence Ethics. And I'm here today with 4 senior leaders from the Coaching Institute, the McLean Harvard Business School, Harvard Medical School. And I'm going to be with you for an hour, and then we also have the opportunity for ongoing networking with Jeff and also with Ho Law afterwards for about half an hour. Can I just run quickly through some of the logistics for you? If as you listen to the presentations and the discussions that occur, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, if you could put those in the chat, and then Jeff and I will keep an eye on that so that we can do the best to get those questions answered for you. And of course, there will be the follow-up networking session for further discussion. Yeah, so what I'm going to do now, if I may, if I come to you, Margaret, to ask you to introduce yourself and your colleagues and the outline, if you like, for the presentation that we're going to be viewing initially.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you to everyone for giving your time and being with us. And I'm very aware, you know, it's 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon in the Boston area, and many of you are here during what would normally be a nice dinner and a glass of wine. And so just recognizing that we've got to compete with that. So hopefully we'll do our best to keep you engaged. I'm Margaret Moore. I'm one of the co-founders of the Institute of Coaching in 2009, and currently the chair. And let me just go around the table. Jeff, do you want to say hello next?
Yes, hi, my name is Jeff Hull, and I'm the executive director at the Institute. Very excited to be here and want to thank Wendy and the team for putting together this amazing conference. We're happy to be here.
That's great. Pamela?
Hello, my name is Pamela Larde. I'm director of education for the Institute of Coaching, and really excited about the conversation that we're going to have around feedback and ethics.
Thanks. And Angie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Passarelli, and I'm the Director of Research for the Institute of Coaching. And like my colleagues, very pleased to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And I should let you all know that this team of the 4 of us, this is the first thing, we're actually kind of a new team in the last few months. And this is the first time we've done something, all 4 of us together. So we're very excited about that. Just a couple of words about the Institute of Coaching. It is an institute that is embedded in the Harvard Medical School system, in particular at McLean Hospital. We started it with the intention of bringing science and to coaches. And the 2 main things we do is translate existing science into coaching practice through webinars and what we call research doses, and then in conferences, et cetera. And the second is that we award coaching research grants and contribute to the scientific literature. So we're both consumers of the science and translators, and we are also helping to produce new science. Excellent. So when we were asked to do this topic, you know, we learned quite quickly that there's not a lot of literature specifically at the intersection of ethics, feedback, and coaching. So I thought as a way to start, we'd go back to just fundamentals. You know, what does the dictionary say? What does some of the relevant models say? And then once I've done that, Angie's going to spend a little time talking about some of the literature. Pamela is going to talk about ethics and coaching from the perspective of racism, which is a very important aspect. And Jeff's going to pull it all together with a model and some recommendations. So I went to the APA dictionary as being perhaps the most relevant to this audience. And so just again, grounding us in the basics. Ethics have to do with principles of morally right conduct accepted by a person or a group or considered appropriate to a specific field. Jeff, the slides just moved to, yeah, that's great.
Sorry about that.
No, not to worry. And okay, so we have ethics is about principles and that a group agree on. Then a moral code has to do with a set of rules concerning right and wrong behavior, okay, that's sort of binding on all members. So I think we have the opportunity to kind of define this. Then feedback has to do with responses or information provided to somebody about the correctness, physical, affect, social, or emotional impact of his or her behavior or thinking. Okay, and then it has the intention, the positive intention, to help change and shape behavior directly. Next slide. So one back.
It's moving too quickly for me.
Yeah, that's okay. These things are jumpy. I just want to contrast that definition of feedback to positive feedback and negative feedback that have also been defined in the dictionary. So positive feedback is affirmation and praise received by a person in response to his or performance. So it's not a full feedback process, but it's an appreciation, acknowledgement, approval, praise. Negative feedback is defined as non-constructive criticism, disapproval. So basically information provided with that may not be, maybe not unethical, maybe too strong a word, but perhaps not with the best of intentions and may not land very well. So that's not what we're going to talk about today. Now, ethics in the context of leadership, which I think is relevant to coaching and feedback, really took a pivot in the early 2000s. And this is from an expert in the area of values-based leadership, which basically, I'll just read the summary here because I think it says it well. History has demonstrated repeatedly that leaders who lack ethical and value-based dimensions can have serious adverse consequences on their followers, their organizations, our nation, and the world. So basically, we could say feedback not done with a values-based approach can also have adverse consequences. So constructs of values-based leadership emerged in response to multiple ethical and moral leadership failures, Enron, WorldCom, et cetera. And in order to restore hope and confidence, leaders needed to cultivate a strong set of values and ethics. And these are now ubiquitous in the leadership literature and a number of models. So all this to say that, we are probably in a stage of evolution of leadership where ethics and values, especially post-pandemic, are becoming more and more important and of course relevant to the topic of feedback. Next slide. So then ethical leadership is a sort of subset of values-based leadership where the conduct is aligned with values, vision, voice, and virtue. It's ethical, it's honest, it's unselfish. The principles include things like trust, fairness, equity, accountability, integrity, authenticity, openness, compassion, respect, all things that we're familiar with as coaches. They really are guiding principles of coaching as well. And when all of these values and principles are followed, organizations benefit better productivity, attitudes, morale, and well-being. So that means applied to feedback that if we follow a set of ethical and values-based principles, we will have better outcomes of that feedback. And my last slide, Jeff. So then I organize those principles just as a starting point. You might have some to add to this list. We can consider them from the self perspective. Am I being open-minded to receive whatever happens in this conversation about feedback? Am I being authentic and honest and trustworthy? Am I bringing integrity? Am I walking the walk? Am I accountable for my role in this conversation and this feedback? And then other focused, am I bringing real compassion? Compassionate leadership is where you are attuned to the needs of the other and serving those? Am I bringing respect? I'm not arrogant. I'm not disrespectful. I see the other as having dignity and value. Am I being fair or just? Is this feedback being delivered in an equitable fashion? You know, would I do the same thing with others? Would I want this for myself? And am I trustworthy? So I think that gives us kind of a foundational starting point to think about feedback and being ethical and values-based in our feedback. So Angela, over to you.
And so where I think that some of the principles that Margaret just outlined can be validated, can be not validated, the opposite of validated, where they can be violated, is informal feedback processes. So I want to take just a moment to pull back the curtain on something that many of us as coaches may utilize without much of a second thought, thinking that we're helping in the best interest of our clients. So what you're seeing here is a distribution of effect sizes for feedback intervention studies that was reported in a meta-analysis by Avi Kluger and Angelo Denisi in the 90s. And in this analysis, they found that feedback interventions, so interventions like 360-degree feedback, performance reviews, grades, teaching evaluations, on average, these interventions had moderate positive effects on performance. They, had slightly improved performance. But what the average was hiding, and Jeff, if you could click one more time, it'll highlight where that average line is that that's not the average line, that's the zero line. What you see there to the left of it is that the average was hiding the fact that 38% of the effects reported in these studies were actually negative, which means that the feedback interventions harmed performance. And this is an ethical concern for coaching because one of the most commonly used feedback interventions is 360 feedback or multi-source feedback, where the leader receives confidential feedback from the people around them, their supervisor, their direct reports, their peers, and others. And our practices around 360 have remained largely unmodified for years. And evidence of this was in 2016, 20 years after this meta-analysis, with the data I'm showing you here on the screen, Rebecca Jones and her colleagues conducted a systematic review of the coaching outcomes literature. And they found a lot of good things, much more detail is in their paper than what I'm about to share. But one of the most alarming things I saw was that coaching interventions that included multi-source feedback were actually less effective than those that didn't include it. So my hope in the next few minutes is to expose some of the challenges with multi-source feedback or 360 feedback. I'm using those two words synonymously, just in an effort to raise ethical awareness around this practice. So this list is by no means comprehensive, but I'd like to flag 4 key challenges or issues. And the first is an assumption that underlines 360 feedback, which is that there exists sort of a one reality that represents an accurate view of someone's performance. And this is often in the eyes of others. And this assumption is flawed in several ways. So first of all, various raters very rarely agree on the same person's performance. So for example, peers' view of a leader's behavior can vary drastically from that same person's direct reports or their supervisor. In fact, peers are often more critical. And if these groups of people are lumped together or aggregated, their viewpoints get lost. It can obscure the more nuanced picture that can actually really help someone change, where they can see where they have strength and where they are less effective. Another problem with this assumption of a singular view is that we're often a bit more generous to ourselves than others are on 360 evaluation. So self-report is often higher than the report of others. So if we've adopted this assumption that there's this singular reality, then it sets up a conflict between how a leader sees themselves and how other people see them. So then the conversation becomes, well, who is right and who's wrong? Which view is right or which is wrong? And some would argue that by simply providing leaders with information about how others view them, it can raise their awareness, and that awareness will help them eliminate the discrepancy between how they view themselves and how others view them. But the risk is what happens to close that gap. What could happen is that leaders' self-views decrease rather than actually changing the behavior that improves the perception of others. And so this second issue is really at the heart of the second flawed assumption, which is this idea of self-other comparison as an effective approach to interpretation of 360 data. Scott Taylor and David Bright argued that comparing self ratings to others' ratings actually sets up a defensive posture. In their paper, they report that only 15% of executives are at a developmental stage where they're really able to receive contradictory data, where they can receive data that is different than their own self views already. So that means the other 85% are likely to either just reject the results of the surveys or the 360, or to become defensive. So the approach that Taylor and Bright suggest is that we use a predicted other comparison as a way to interpret the data. And in predicted other process, the coach would ask the feedback recipient, the leader, to predict how others will view them, asking questions like, how does my supervisor experience me? What am I like when I'm interacting with my supervisor? What am I like when I'm interacting with my direct reports? And so this takes the focus off the self. And so it would reduce defensiveness, and it would emphasize context. So the relationships and settings in which the leader interacts with the people who are rating their behavior. And it also, a predicted other versus a self-other comparison also puts the recipient more in a mode of inquiry than advocacy of their own views. So that leads us to number 3, which is ethical issues around the quality of information that's included in 360 evaluation. Now, it's relatively rare that raters are equipped with the skills to give truly constructive, effective feedback. And what's worse is that many of them fall victim to cognitive biases inadvertently. This is not intentional, but these cognitive biases disadvantage women and people of color. Women and people of color may be rated more harshly in their performance than their mainstream counterparts, and yet still be denied the constructive criticism that they need in order to develop because of a leniency bias toward them. So quality of information is another issue. And then finally, the last piece around ethics of feedback that I'd like to highlight is thinking about the person who's going to receive this feedback, the person being coached. Is that feedback recipient in a good position to be receptive to the feedback? If they're not, then there's an ethical issue that we're wasting resources. But even if they are open and receptive to feedback, presenting someone with data puts them into an analytic reasoning mode, which narrows their attention, and it neurologically constrains their ability to be open and creative. So we need to be thoughtful as an ethical question about when is the right time in the coaching engagement to share feedback. I would argue that sharing it as a first step or an early step is not good for the client. It's not in their best interest. Or if we realize that the person who's going to receive the feedback is already stressed or distressed, then I think providing them with feedback, even if it's positive, could be a question of ethics for the coach. So these 4 challenges that I've outlined here lead to a number of ethical questions that and there are more than simply these, but I wanted to share some of these as a way to start thinking through, get your wheels turning about what are the kinds of questions we should be asking relative to formalized feedback processes. So I will just leave these here as a placeholder. I'm not going to read through them all. Maybe I'll give you a second to take them in, and then we will move on to Pamela.
Angela, before we move on, We've got a question in the chat about hearing your definition of 360 feedback and how it's done.
So I think there's a couple of different ways of 360 feedback. For some of the self-other comparison points that I was talking about and the assumption of the singular reality, I'm talking about quantitative tools that have a feedback recipient is able to select a number of people around them, usually the supervisor, direct reports and peers, maybe clients and customers, or others who they would like to respond to a quantitative survey. Then those responses are aggregated to maintain confidentiality and fed back to the client in a coaching context. And when I say client, I mean the person being coached. There is another iteration of that, which is where a coach would interview qualitatively those same group of people all the way around them, and then produce a report through the interpretive lens of the coach that again would be fed back to them. And sometimes even in the quantitative version of a 360, there may be kind of verbatim responses or open-ended responses that get collated and shared verbatim, exactly as the respondents say it, with no filtering. Generally, if a coach is doing the interviewing in a live 360 setting, the feedback, there may be some direct quotes, but it would be largely filtered through the coach's lens. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Yes, and Andrea, I also see the filtering of the coach. Yeah, in trying to make this 5 minutes, I didn't have it, I couldn't get to it all. Absolutely, I agree that the filtering of the coach is an ethical issue. So wonderful.
Yeah, I was actually going to dive into that question too. When I saw it there, I thought, this folds really nicely into the part that I'm going to be talking about as we look at harmful intercultural feedback. And just to touch on that question, Andrea, I would definitely venture to say that or actually this question was from Angela, but I would venture to say that the system dysfunction can have a profound impact on the effectiveness of the coaching and the results. And that gets us into a conversation also looking at psychological safety and whether or not people are going to feel safe enough to give that honest feedback. So it's a great point to raise there. So I wanted to take this from the standpoint of the environment and the interpersonal relationships that are taking place within that feedback dynamic. And so in looking at that, one of the more difficult yet compelling aspects of this to talk about that has really kind of surfaced as an important discussion is that around intercultural dialogue, intercultural engagement. Where does race fit in? And not only just when I talk about intercultural, not just talking about race, but also truly looking at intercultural. So within different identities, there are embedded cultural aspects to those identities, whether we are talking about gender or sexuality, religion, socioeconomic background. There are a lot of different dynamics that come into play interculturally as it pertains to feedback. So what I wanted to first look at were two examples of what harmful intercultural feedback might look like and how that might surface. And the first one is this concept called spirit murdering. And this was originally developed by Patricia Williams in 1987 and furthered by researcher Love, and she talks about it from the standpoint of what's going on in education and higher ed. Williams began her work looking at what happens at also in education, but at the elementary school level, particularly originally her research looking at the experiences of young boys and their teachers, Black boys and their teachers, and what spirit murdering looks like in that context. And I'll give you a sense of what that is. after laying the foundation. Love looks at it also, not only in higher education, but also in corporate entities, and how this can play out, and particularly how women have been impacted by this concept of spirit murdering. So what it is, and I'll read it verbatim here, but it's denial of inclusion, protection, safety, nurturance, and acceptance because of fixed yet fluid and moldable structures of racism. And so and I actually have a quote here from Patricia Williams that I really wanted to make sure I highlighted. But she basically says that racism is more than just physical pain, but that it also robs us of our livelihood, our aspirations, our dreams. And so when we experience this in the context of feedback, it effectively creates an engagement of spirit murdering. And what that means is that if somebody is offering feedback that says in so many words, it doesn't even have to be literal, it doesn't even have to be intentional, that what it is you're aspiring to is not going to happen for you, or because of your identity, this is not something that is that we're going to support, or that's ideal for you, or that your evidence of what other people of your background have done does not lend itself to you being able to do the same. Now, these messages aren't always just given verbatim in exactly the words that I'm saying. An example might be when somebody is applying for a promotion of some sort, and they are not necessarily, they're with the team, but they have outside applicants. The outside applicants are favorable because their names are known better and we're familiar with the colleague. So yeah, it's cute that you applied, but this applicant, look what this applicant brings to the table. And that's a form of spirit murdering. And these kinds of things absolutely do happen. So spirit murdering values dominance over selective humility. Humility is this concept that I am learning, I'm humble, I don't know everything about everybody's experience, but I'm open to learn it. The concept of spirit murdering values that idea of being dominant over somebody, over having a sense of humility, even if you're the person in position of giving that feedback. Next, it emphasizes the majority lens. I'm sorry, no, just go back one. It emphasizes the majority lens over the whole person integration. So whatever the lens is of the majority of that organization or that company or that environment or that context, that's the one that matters more than the experience of the whole person. And then it suppresses voice over magnifying voice. So we're going to suppress the voice of the person being given feedback, rather than allowing that voice to come through in the feedback process. Now we can move to the next slide. And then alienating communication comes from the Rosenthal's book on looking at nonviolent communication. And when we look at the ways that communication and engagement and human connection are cut off, alienating communication was one key way that this happens. And this is specific forms of language and communication that contributes to our behaving violently toward each other and ourselves. And there's a lot of sensitivity that comes from using the word violent and violently. And this was intentional with the concept of nonviolent communication. And what violence generally is any kind of language or engagement interaction that causes harm upon another person. And we all know that our words, our nuances, our tone can all do that. And so really being intentional in our communication about making sure that we are not causing harm and that communication is not violent. And so three, elements here under alienating communication. It is disconnection and judgment. We value that over relationship and development. We value comparison over centering the strengths of the individuals. And then we value denial of responsibility over mutual responsibility. So even the person providing the feedback has and acknowledges some level of responsibility. And so I think there's one more, and if there's not, then I can wrap it. I think that, yeah, there is one more. And so ideally speaking, in a feedback engagement that's intercultural in nature, a way to avoid the spirit murdering, a way to avoid, the communication that blocks compassion is, number one, we approach feedback with a lens that integrates the recipient's experience. Who are they? What's their journey? What lens do they bring to the table? Let's integrate that into the feedback experience. Number two, identify your own traumas around feedback and break that cycle. If I were to think about just my own journey and the manner in which feedback has been provided to me, if there are some traumatic experiences around that feedback, how do I make sure I shed those so that in my own leadership role, I don't reproduce that kind of experience for somebody else? And then finally, magnify both voices in the feedback exchange. And I think in just personally speaking, in some of the most powerful feedback experiences I've had, my voice was valued and was highly important in the process. It wasn't just about what the coach or the supervisor or the other leader was putting on the table, but it was also my perspective and my view as well. So that's all I have. I see Leslie, is there a question? Let's say the client has received feedback outside of the coaching engagement. To what extent is helping people to adapt? So this might be for everybody. To what extent is helping people to free themselves from the demand to adapt and conform an ethical act? That's a great question. Are we addressing these now, or should?
Maybe we should finalize, finish. Yeah, just
Yeah.
for the sake of time and hold on to it for the moment.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. I think it is a good one for the later discussion, really, when everybody can sort of get involved in that, Pamela. But thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for stopping.
Thank you, Pam.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, take a deep breath, everyone. There's a lot of information. There's so many different topics. What I wanted to do, just in sort of wrapping us up, was just to bring in one more frame of research that's been done that definitely impacts everything that has to do with feedback, which is the neuroscience research, and then maybe summarize with a bit of a framework that might be helpful for coaches to put this into practice, and then take us back to Margaret's core principles to have us reflect. So just in terms of what the neuroscience has been showing us the last few years, it's pretty clear that many of you have probably heard of this thing called the amygdala hijack, which is basically the way the human brain reacts to anything that creates a fight or flight mechanism. And in most cases, unfortunately, feedback, when it's not well designed through all the kinds of things that Angela and Pam has described, leads to an unfortunate reaction in the brain, and leads to defensiveness, and leads to people not taking the feedback in a way that gets assimilated, integrated, and put to practical positive use. So the research around the neuroscience of reactivity has been explored extensively, especially by Richard Biatzis and his team, and also by the folks at the Neuro Leadership Institute run by David Rock. And I'm not going to take the time to go through this chart, but it's just to give you an idea that the studies, the fMRI studies that Richard and his team have done, have really shown that coaching, what he calls coaching for compliance, which is basically, this is what you need to hear, and this is what you need to change, and this is what you need to do in order to be effective. That may actually work in some situations, but ultimately, if you look at the upper right-hand side of what his chart shows, if we're looking for things like organizational commitment, good organizational citizenship level behavior, high quality connections, long-term sustained change, we really need to think about coaching with compassion, which is really starting with the positive. Likewise, if we look at this chart on the right that was created by the Neuro Leadership Institute, You know, these are the 5 areas that they found through numerous fMRI studies really are the core defensive mechanisms that defensive areas that show up when people receive feedback that is not well thought through, not positive, not psychologically safe, all of the kinds of things, not interculturally safe, sensitive, that Angela and Pam were pointing out, that these areas like status, certainty, autonomy, and relatedness, and a sense of fairness tend to put people in a defensive mode, whether we like it or not. And that is true of all of us as humans, because it's the way the brain reacts. So if we think about that and we want to do this in a way, we want to give feedback in a way that may be more likely to be effective, more likely to be successful, then this is a potential model for coaches to think through. It's a acronym that I created for a group of coaches in Korea that they've been put into a place that has been demonstrating to be effective for them. It's not a validated instrument at this point, but it's just a tool that may be helpful for coaches that are reflecting on all the kinds of concerns that we've just raised in this session, and to think about taking your feedback exercises through these steps. So first, are you being specific? I call it spirit. So are you being specific? Are you thinking about the actual behavior, the data that's useful? Are you backing up what you're saying or bringing to the feedback container with facts and actionable data? Are you approaching your feedback container, the engagement of feedback, with an affirming, expanding, and positive approach? And then are you being intentional? And this gets at what Angela and Pam were pointing to. Have you stepped back as a coach or leader that's providing feedback to think about your positioning? What is the point? What are you trying to accomplish? What is your purpose? Do you have a positive intent? Are you being culturally and racially sensitive? Are you reflecting on your own stance? And then, is this relevant? Is it actionable? Is it useful for the recipient? Or is it something that's really more that you would like to see as the coach or as the leader, but have you thought through the implications of the receiving end of the feedback? And then really getting at the neuroscience again, what the studies have shown around self-determination theory, and also Boyatz's work on the brain's reaction around compassionate coaching, is that people need to have an intrinsic motivation to change. So we can give feedback all day long, but whether it leads to actionable change really will be translated by whether or not the receiver has a generated intrinsic sense of motivation. So are they reflective? Are they aware of the impact of what they're doing, and how can they take what they're hearing, what they're being given as feedback, whether it's through a 360 instrument or through a direct interaction with a boss or with a coach, and are they integrating that and finding their own sense of motivation from within, a sense of autonomy? And then finally, the timing and the context. And this gets to something that all of us have mentioned at various times during this presentation, which is there a safe space? Is there the proper contextualization for delivering feedback? So this is just a template that you might want to play with as a coach to be thinking about being more effective in delivery. And then finally, I just want to take us back to some of the foundational principles that Margaret mentioned and leave you with some questions to reflect on. So Margaret talked about openness, authenticity, respect, compassion, fairness, trust, and equity. So what is the level of openness and confidentiality that you're bringing into the feedback process? What is the level of authenticity and respect? What is the container in terms of fairness? And is there a sense of trust or equity? How will you address these issues? And then finally, what does feedback with compassion really look like in the real world? So just some reflective questions for you to think through when you take us all the way back to where Margaret started with her foundational principles based on values or purpose-driven leadership. And with that, I think
Thank you, Jeff.
Our final slide. So we have
thank you all very much.
We have time for a few questions.
We have got a few questions that are coming through. There was the sort of more general question for discussion that Leslie raised earlier that was mentioned. And then we've got also Lillian's thought about questions that are asked and methods used prior to the feedback session that lead to a spirit fulfilling feedback session. People loving sort of the framework that's been described here. And then a comment about having heard that 15%, somebody's mentioned that 15% of leaders are not ready to receive feedback. Can more be said about that? Yeah. And then of course there's the questions you've raised yourself. So how would you like to deal with those questions in the chat, or do you want to go into, with the time we've got, Jeff, do you want to go into breakout for some discussion generally?
I think we really only have about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, we don't have
minutes.
a lot. Yeah.
So it might be worthwhile just to take the questions from wherever they land on one of the four of us.
Okay. So you're probably the best person to decide of your colleagues who's the best person to respond.
You want to give us the question again?
Right. So we've got Leslie, the idea of helping people to adapt to feedback they've had and this sort of expectation for them to conform to something within their context. Is that itself an ethical act? Freeing them from those expectations and the demand to conform, is that an ethical act?
Well, I think that I'll just make one comment, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues, but I think the one thing that has been shown to be key to having feedback become actionable is, as I said toward the end of my piece, was to create a container in which the feedback generates an intrinsic sense of motivation from the recipient. So it's not acting in a form of compliance, like I am going to take this feedback and put it into action because of my coach or because of the leader, but I am going to integrate this feedback, reflect on it, and then find within myself that sense of autonomy, motivation, and intrinsic desire to change. So it behooves us as coaches and as leaders to think about what is the motivation rather than sort of imposing, because as Angela said at the outset, you could give positive feedback to someone and not necessarily generate behavior change, because it needs to become intrinsically motivating for that individual. So that becomes a really key aspect of timing, context, safety, purpose. What is the reason that we're giving the feedback? So those are the comments. What does it take to create a container in which the individual receiving feedback becomes intrinsically motivated for their own best interests, not just to be in compliance? Other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, Jeff, let me add to that. So just coming back to the idea that there's a foundation of values that leaders live by. I think what I would want to do with a leader is say, hey, stand back, and what values are important to you in delivering feedback? If it was you in their shoes, how would what's important to you here? And then what would that look like in this case? And do you, and then as if you have an opportunity to give feedback to the folks giving feedback, to make a request to honor those values. So I think having the person receiving the feedback ground themselves in what's important to them, which is honoring what they want, and coming from that place. So they're not just having to have other people's values stuffed down their throat. They actually have a chance to say, okay, I'm a leader and these are the values that I would want to see. And that's how I'm going to process this.
Okay, thank you. So just to move on to another question here from Lillian, was that, and others as well, are asking for examples of questions and methods that are used prior to the feedback session that would lead to a spirit fulfilling feedback session in itself.
I mean, I would just say, as a starting point to answer that question, is to if you go back to a values, purpose-driven context and a safe contextual container, that the starting point would be alignment between the goals of the individual and the goals of the organization, and a sensitivity around what are the values that are underlying the person who's receiving the feedback. What is their, what is important to them? And so if there's an alignment, then and a sensitivity from the deliverer of feedback, that chances are enhanced that there'll be a positive outcome. And I think this gets back to Pam, you might want to comment on this, because I think a lot of what you were speaking to was the lack of sensitivity and awareness in on the part of the person delivering the feedback around the narrative of the receiver, the values, the story, the the deeper context from which that person has emerged. Or
yeah, I think that some of the questions that we might want to ask ourselves prior to even going, if as the person giving the feedback, is how do I honor the whole of this person who I'm going to be engaging with? Because really, though my section is called, intercultural, the intercultural piece of it, really what it was is it's the human engagement, it's the human connection piece of it. And regardless of what background you're coming from, even if the person is coming from what you perceive as the same background, which even then there are going to be nuances. The question is, how do I honor this individual and in terms of their wholeness, and their journey, where they're coming from, where they are, and where they would like to be, and not necessarily what I'm trying to dictate to them. But I also agree that there's got to be some synergy between their goals and who they are and what they want, and that of the organization. And so that's important, but the whole person element of it is going to be the thing that motivates them to move in the direction that is desirable, focusing on those values that are valuable, for them in their journey.
And I'd like to add on to this from the perspective of intentional change theory. So my background and my primary role is as a faculty member, and I'm also a research fellow with the Coaching Research Lab out of Case Western Reserve University, where we work with Richard Boyatzis and many of his colleagues on intentional change theory. And the sort of cornerstone piece of intentional change theory is that sustained desired change is anchored by a clear and compelling vision of one's ideal self. So this is really clearly knowing who someone aspires to be. And so you're not even relating to them in terms of their short-term goals or their sort of present day goals. What has to precede 360 feedback, or any kind of feedback really, is a deep exploration of passion, purpose, values, and an articulation of that in some way. And in our practice, we actually encourage people to write it down, either using words or some kind of symbols. It could be through art, it could be through music. Most of the time it's through language. And that then becomes a reference point against which to accept the feedback. So you're not looking at how does this feedback inform who I am today. It's how does this feedback inform what I need to do to be the person I aspire to be. And it's a different way. It's a different mindset, really. And I think it also, what that does is, I don't know how many of you have started your feedback coaching engagements with feedback, but I see that happen. And it almost sets up a contentious relationship between the coach and the coachee, no matter how wonderful the coach is. And if you start, though, with this exploration of the ideal self, this possible future version of me that is all that I aspire to be, knowing that I don't show up like that every day, now the coach relates to the absolute best of what that person can be, rather than what they really are today. And it creates this safe, trusting relational space that then helps the feedback process be a little bit easier to digest.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Angela, because when you look at the model that I shared, the last of the spirit model is timing. And I think I probably didn't say enough about that, but it's really crucial for us as coaches in particular to think about when is the appropriate time, moment, space, and ultimately intrinsically motivating opportunity to provide feedback. And I totally agree that far too often, I know myself very practically, I've been given client engagements and the boss says, oh, we should do 360, even before I really know the person, even before I know their story, their aspirations, their dreams. So here I am being given a short list of feedback issues, so to speak, long before, and to deliver that to someone at the outset, sort of, to my mind, undermines the likelihood of effective success. And it really is an ethical question, because as a coach, there are moments where you need to stand up and be values driven yourself and say, I'm not really sure that just delivering to this new client, brand new, building a relationship, learning, trying to understand, trying to be sensitive to their best self, as you point out, giving them feedback in this moment is probably not really going to help them. So it's an ethical stance for us as coaches to contract from that place with our
Sure, and
client.
for the organization too. I mean, it takes a lot of time for folks, all these different people, to respond to that feedback. I mean, there's an investment there from the organization, and we want to make sure that there's a return on the investment. And sometimes we don't set ourselves up for success around that, I think.
Right.
I'd like to just use that as a jumping off point for an alternative perspective on this, which doesn't come from the scientific literature, but probably a lot of you have read Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor, which is the first part of the book is really about all that goes wrong when people are not given feedback and then say just fired. And, and that there's this phenomenon called ruinous empathy, where you ruin someone by not checking in and providing continuous feedback. But the other part of her book, speaking to what Angie and Jeff are saying around intentional change and having a vision for yourself, Kim Scott makes the point, and has practiced this in her tech jobs, that if you make time with people to create a vision for themselves, that then you can bring the feedback into that conversation on a routine basis in a very positive fashion. So there's also ethical issues around not giving feedback that I think it's worth just putting into the conversation.
Well, to acknowledge, Michael, your comment was so timely, Margaret, because Michael Marks in the box said, if the client needs a fast solution, does waiting on feedback not disserve the client's needs? And I think just putting together what you said, there is a level of discipline that we have to have as coaches and leaders to know when to hold back and when to say, you know what, now's not the time. But we also have to have a level of intuition to say, okay, but now we do need to interject and to say and do something at this point.
Yeah, which is why timing is so crucial, and to be very thoughtful about, it's not about not giving or giving feedback. It's about when, how, and in what context.
Yeah, and I think one of the differences here could be, Michael, is, if this is an issue that's going to derail, that's different than an issue that's going to develop. Now, those are kind of two separate forms of feedback that have different ethical dimensions, in my mind, at least.
But it also calls into question the alignment point that I made earlier, which is that if the individual's values are not in alignment with the organization, that the ultimate outcome of them not being with the organization could in fact be a good thing. So we also have to step back and get clarity around what are the values of this individual? Is their aspiration one that fits with the ultimate goals of the organization? And that could be something that as a coach, you can interpret quite quickly. But again, timing is everything, because you should not predetermine, because the boss or whoever is hiring you as a coach has already made up their mind. And I've seen that far too often, where you're brought in as a coach sort of as a last chance effort to sort of fix this person or whatever. So these are really thorny questions that really have to be handled on a truly individualist based on an individual basis, I think.
Just to pick up your point there about timing, we're just conscious of sort of coming towards the end of our sort of session before the networking event, Jeff.
Sure.
And there are, Kirsten's asked, made a point about the huge responsibility that the coach has, and sort of picking up on the idea there is no one truth but multiple truths. And part of the coach's role is to sort of help navigate through that. And then we've also got some questions in the chat, some clarification on the stats about whether it's 15% of leaders who are ready for to give feedback, receive feedback or not, you know, that sort of thing. A question about where the participants can access some of the longitudinal data. So I just wanted to just bring that to your attention, but also to give you all of you who've shared such interesting and thought-provoking concepts with us today, a final thought to share with those who are listening to you, for them to go away and reflect on. Perhaps they can't continue on the networking session, but to take away. So could I come back to you on that, and that we can pick up, if you can stay, of course, and Ho Law will be helping Jeff to open up the discussion further about these aspects. So please stay after this particular session ends shortly. But just to come back to the four presenters, final thought, final word of wisdom, or something disruptive to throw into the pot before we close.
Well, one thing I'd like to clarify is that stat about 15%. So this isn't 15% that are ready to receive feedback in general. That's 15% who are able to receive contradictory feedback. So feedback that is not aligned with one's own views. So people are fairly receptive of feedback that matches what they already believe, even when those beliefs are negative. But it's something different and a higher developmental level to be able to accept feedback that is contradictory to one's own views. So that's what that 15% number was.
Thank you.
And if I think I saw somewhere, if I can find it quickly enough in the next 3 minutes, I'll put a link to the article with that first graph here in the chat. So give me just a moment to get that.
And I think we can hopefully keep the chat. If anyone wants to follow up with us, we're happy to continue the conversation offline. So we'll make it such we can all be reached. The last comment that I would make is simply, as ethical coaches, based on everything we've just discussed, one thing we always have to be willing and able and prepared to do is to give feedback to the organization instead of feedback to the client. In other words, it may be appropriate for us to give feedback to the sponsors before we give feedback to the coachee.
Indeed.
Margaret here. I'd like to just throw out a thought that's come to my mind. You know, we put this together for this event, and of course, we're being provoked and expanding our thoughts too with you. And, you know, the word ethics has a coldness about it. And I wonder if the larger container here, just a plug, the Institute published a report on a study we called Leading with Humanity, the Future of Leadership and Coaching. And one of the models we referred to is compassionate leadership as one of the latest fashions in leadership. And I wonder if the word compassion, which is a more warmer word, can also help us think about feedback as being the most ethical, that we really are attuned to the other, what they need, what they want, where they're going, what will most help them. And that I wonder if it's possible that that's a bigger construct than ethics and more appealing to coaches.
Thank you.
Pam? You get the last word, Pam.
I'm like, whoa, that's big. I will just have to say that I love what you just said, Margaret. This is me cheating a little bit because I'm using your last point, but this concept of compassion is huge, and it speaks more to the human element, the whole person element, where, you know, in ethics, again, we're not knocking ethics at all, but I think that is something that really speaks more to the human being as opposed to following a set of expectations for a profession. And so I'm with you wholeheartedly on that.
Okay.
Well said.
thank you so much to Margaret, Jeff, Angie and Pam for what you've shared with us, and those who can stay on. I'm sure the next half hour of discussion is going to be extremely interesting, and we can confirm that there will be information put on your site on the ethics forum for you to access email contact details for our 4 presenters. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to those who have contributed your own thoughts in the chat. That's been great. And I hope you can go on to have even more discussion now.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.